Let's look at some highlights in this remarkable gospel and then pull things together. I want to draw a little more attention to these formula quotations because they are so distinctive. There are quite a few of them, and in the lecture outline I put the formula quotations and then the Old Testament texts they're referring to. I want to look at one of the infamous ones in Matthew 2:15. Let's start back in 2:13 after the wise men, astrologers really, have departed. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Take this child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Joseph was faithful. He rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. And they remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet Hosea. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And now let's look at Hosea chapter 11. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And many readers think, wait a minute, this is about the Exodus. And this refers to leaving Egypt, the Exodus, rather than a flight into Egypt. What gives? We have to read on. We have to look at the context of the passage. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son," in the Exodus. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. And yet, it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. Ephraim at this stage refers to the whole people of Israel. "I took them up by their arms, but they didn't know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them." That sounds sweet, but this is the lament of a jilted parent who poured grace on a people that are stubborn and followed false gods instead. They won't return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria will be their king, because they have refused to return to me. The sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, and devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me, and though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. And that is the pain and the grief of a jilted parent who's been spurned by an unloving child. But the moment of anger passes. "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah or treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a human being. I am the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. They shall go after Yahweh. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, declares Yahweh. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit, but Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One." And Jesus, descendant of David, Lion of Judah, is above all and to the end faithful to the Holy One. So he will return from Egypt. I think we're misdirected here by the common name for this passage, the flight into Egypt. It's really a flight into and out of Egypt. Instead of getting entangled in the nations, like the Hebrews had in the book of Exodus, or like Israel did in its days of exile, Jesus is protected from Herod the way Israel was protected from a famine in Egypt. And before long, and before he's even old enough to know it, the coast is clear, and the family can return into the promised land, and Jesus can proceed to reconcile his people to the Lord. Take some time to investigate more of these formula quotations, at least the ones where we can find the scriptures that they refer to. One of them, Matthew 2:23, is a pretty baffling mystery. Another highlight, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount, in many ways the jewel of Matthew's Gospel. I'm afraid to go there to show you details because I won't be able to resist the temptation to read the whole thing. You can understand why the audiences say, "We have never heard authority like this. Who is this guy?" The Sermon on the Mount is immensely influential in Christianity. It's where we get the Lord's Prayer. It's where we get the Beatitudes. It's really the charter of the Baptist churches. It's their canon within the canon. That's true of Matthew's broader gospel too. His focus on the church, on discipleship, on discipline, on forgiveness, on accountability, all of those things became the DNA of the Anabaptists and the Baptist movements outside them. I'll just give you one piece of advice in interpreting the Sermon on the Mount. Don't isolate it from the narrative context of this gospel and the focus that's coming on taking up our cross and following him on the way of the cross. The Beatitudes are not just abstract principles like fortune cookies. They will make so much more sense and have so much more power when viewed in light of Jesus' coming crucifixion and resurrection. If Matthew's focus on church and discipleship made it a favorite among Baptists, His focus on accountability and grace made him a favorite among the Wesleyan tradition. Richard Hayes, my New Testament teacher, considers Matthew a very Wesleyan gospel, impossibly high standards and impossibly lavish grace. And that combination gives you something that one without the other cannot. It really means there's no ceiling to our spiritual growth, and there's always another chance when we blow it, as the disciples, including Peter here, do. We've already seen passages about binding and loosing, specifically about the disciples doing that. Well, Jesus is doing it all along and showing them how. We've already seen it in chapter 12 when Jesus schools the Pharisees that the Sabbath laws, like all the Torah, are for mercy, not shallow sacrifice. He's loosing the Sabbath rule and showing where and when and why it applies in the ways it does. In the Sermon on the Mount, by contrast, we see him binding the Torah, tightening the rules on divorce and murder to include attitudes of the heart. He's showing how it is that he fulfills the law and the prophets, that he's their goal and their substance. He's applying the Torah in the kingdom of heaven and showing how it really works. Here's a highlight in chapter 11 that puts a fine point on something that's demonstrated throughout Matthew's gospel. That is the way, in Mark Allen Powell's words, that God is present in Jesus, who's present in his disciples, which are present in the world. Let's start at verse 25. Jesus declared, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden all these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yea, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." That highlighted verse in the middle is what some scholars call a bolt out of the Johannine blue. What that means is like a lightning strike on a cloudless day. This verse sounds right out of the Gospel of John. Where did it come from? And what is it doing here in the Gospel of Matthew? Well, it's doing what I just described. It's encapsulating a theme that's found all through Matthew's Gospel, but it's here all in one verse. All these features, all these distinctives that Matthew adds to what's in Mark, while basically affirming what's in Mark. Matthew incorporates Mark's themes into his Gospel alongside his own, rather than abandoning them or pillaging them for his own use, or revising them beyond recognition. Matthew honors Mark even while transcending a lot of what Mark is doing. Recall that Mark ends abruptly with a charge to go back to Galilee where we will see him. I wonder whether Matthew took up Mark's invitation, went back to Galilee, went back to the traditions, and pressed their implications and drew the conclusions that are there to be drawn. I can see why churches soon learn to lean more on Matthew than on Mark's ironic, dramatic, ambiguous mystery. Mark seems a better missional gospel, something for people who aren't convinced, something for people who are intrigued by Jesus, but not ready to sign up yet, or who have sensibilities that really need dislodging and shaking up. Whereas Matthew seems a more suitable gospel for disciples who have learned and are ready to learn more and put that learning to work. So here's your visual from the book of Kells. Matthew is the human being. Think of Matthew as the disciple who's read Mark, gone back to Galilee, and is ready for more. But don't forget that even veteran disciples still occasionally need Mark's refresher course. We can get stuck in ruts and need dislodging all over again. It's wise that churches who have lectionaries that travel through the same passages every few years read Matthew every third year and also read Mark every third year. In the kingdom of heaven, you're never quite through orientation. There are always jolts and shocks to come. And yet in the kingdom of heaven, even if you just have a mustard seed's worth of faith, you're ready for more.